Clock Tower Rewind has released, and I think it's a pretty interesting release for a variety of reasons, and I wanted to talk a little about that, particularly since I've seen a lot of confusion about what it even is, so here's a one-stop review / ramble about the latest attempt to revive a survival horror classic. So the first thing I think is worth putting out there is that Clock Tower Rewind is not a remaster, a remake, or a anything of the sort. It is a pretty straight port of the Super Nintendo version, almost certainly running in an emulator wrapper. How you feel about that is going to be up to you. I personally don't really think there's anything wrong with emulated re-releases, but I know that, as I have labored in the past on videos on the other channel, PC gamers have a somewhat strained relationship with emulation-based re-releases, because they are historically not used to paying for emulation. I'm not going to relitigate whether that's a valid position or not, but it is what it is. So as buyer's advice, right off the bat, this is a Super Nintendo game. Like, a Super Nintendo game with nearly no alterations. So if you're the kind of person who will be pissed off at buying a Super Nintendo game for about $15, then don't buy a Super Nintendo game for $15. People always tend to ask me, what's the merit of this instead of just emulating, and I don't really find that to be a compelling line of reasoning, because you could apply it to basically any video game. Why buy anything when you can just pirate it? And I don't have the answers for that. You're gonna have to ask yourself how you feel about that. I'm gonna go on and describe the rest of the video game, okay? So what actually is Clock Tower? Clock Tower is essentially a point-and-click adventure game at its core, but it's also one of the pioneering examples of pursuer-type horror games. You're exploring a big mansion, trying to collect items and solve puzzles in a fairly traditional point-and-click style interface. They have added mouse control to this version of the game, which is very nice, which means it controls a little bit more naturally than steering a cursor around the screen with a D-pad, although you can still do that if you want. But the additional spice of this is that you will often be pursued by the Scissor Man, a menacing figure who will try to trap you in a dead end and kill you. Clock Tower is a little basic by modern standards in its construction. I think I personally enjoy it more for its historical value, especially for how it would evolve into Human Entertainment's later releases, like the Twilight Syndrome games, and particularly Yuyami Dori Tankentai. It's definitely something I appreciate as one of the earliest efforts in this genre. In a period of time where games couldn't even vaguely grasp at being realistic, Clock Tower put up a shockingly cinematic-type effort, considering this is a Super Nintendo game. This released in '96. Human Entertainment were constantly ahead of their time and constantly pushing the envelope. I think a truly modern player might find it a bit quaint, but if you're the kind of person who can appreciate a retro game for what it is, then I think you will find quite a bit to like in Clock Tower. Its atmosphere and visuals are just top-notch for the system, top-of-the-shelf stuff. And this release translates that more or less perfectly to modern consoles and PC, since it is essentially the Super Nintendo game running unchanged. They have added a translation. This is in fact the first time the game has been officially translated and released outside of Japan, albeit the fan translation for this game has existed since 2001. Which means, realistically, if you've wanted to play Clock Tower in English, you have had a lot of time to do so. As for that new translation, it's perfectly fine, no issues detected from me. Clock Tower's script was not very dense in the first place. It wasn't a game with a whole lot of dialogue, and it uses pretty simple language. So there wasn't a lot of ways they could possibly have botched it, and they didn't. The most differences that can be readily observed is that some of the words have slightly changed, like instead of various technical books on this bookcase, it's various specialized books now. Spicy. However, this release is not without issues, and in fact I'd say there's 3 major ones, so let's go through those. The first issue is that every time you encounter a story-critical scene that unlocks one of the new extras they have, it displays a full-screen notification that completely covers up what you're doing and doesn't even pause the game, so the game is still playing out underneath this huge-ass pop-up box. I have no idea why. Unless you're running the game in the visual mode that stretches it to 16:9 like an absolute freak, then there will be plenty of space on the sides of the screen in the pillar boxing. It's a 4:3 game. I don't understand why these notifications couldn't have been made a little smaller and tucked themselves neatly away into the pillar boxing. These cannot be disabled, are very distracting, and are guaranteed to happen on your first playthrough, meaning they will kinda damage the first-time experience. Very baffling. The second major issue is the now kind of insane way that saving works. In the tradition of retro re-releases, they have added a save state system to the release. which I have mixed feelings about how all these retro re-releases just give save states unconditionally to the player because, well, emulators can do it, so why not? I don't know, maybe there is sometimes a reason not to. But regardless, Clock Tower has managed to use them in the strangest way possible in that the save states have replaced the game's normal saving system. Firstly, you don't have save states, you have save state, singular, one per file. And you can't save to new slots arbitrarily, you have to, like, start a new game in slot 2 if you want to make a save in slot 2. I'm not even explaining this very well. The fact that it's, like, difficult to explain indicates how confusing it is. And secondly, if you want to load your game, you have to load from a save state. You can't load from the battery backup save that Clock Tower does have. Clock Tower Super Nintendo is actually surprisingly modern in this regard. It has a functioning autosave system. A very generous one too, it autosaves on every single room you enter. This means that if you do something like complete the game and get one of the game's 9 endings, and then quit without making a save state, the next time you boot the game, you will be forced to load from the last save state you made, which may be before you got the ending, overriding the game's own battery backup save and removing your progress. Since normally Clock Tower autosaves when you get a given ending, it logs it to a list that you can peruse. This is baffling to me. I don't think Clock Tower needed a save state system. Its existing save system is already perfectly modern. It autosaves on pretty much every single room transition, and on completing the game and getting an ending, it will log it to its internal save data. It's a point-and-click adventure game. You're not exactly going to need to make a save before a tough boss fight, you know? This is one of those choices where adding a modern feature actually somehow makes the game feel less modern. They have managed to use save states to replace a game's autosave with what is now essentially manual saving. That's really strange to me. I've never seen any release like that. Because those whippersnappers, the kids these days, these modern gamers, they're not used to games that don't autosave. And Clock Tower actually does. There wouldn't need to have been anything done for this. It's already accommodating to that kind of player. And yet save states were added, and in doing so, messed it up. Very peculiar stuff. The third major issue relates to the new game mode that was added, so let's get into that. In addition to the traditional original mode, where you play the original Super Famicom game pretty much unaltered, there is Rewind mode, new to this version of the game. It adds stuff that was originally added to the game in the later re-releases, notably the PlayStation version, and it does in fact do that perfectly fine. There's a laundry list of minor tweaks, like you can run up and down stairs now, before Jennifer just slowly walked up and down them, and it takes ages for some reason. Your stamina recovers faster if you take a break. Minor things like that. It's nice to have, but doesn't make a massive difference overall. And to be clear about what Rewind mode is, this is essentially a ROM hack of the Super Nintendo game. It isn't literally the PS1 version. They have taken the extra content from the PS1 version and ROM hacked it back into the Super Nintendo version, plus a couple of tweaks. It's not a massive amount of new content. I think the clearest indicator is that someone was able to ROM hack stuff from a PS1 game back into a SNES cartridge. SNES cartridges are very small, you know. In fact, the content of Rewind mode is nearly identical to a fan ROM hack that was released in 2023 called Clock Tower Deluxe. And to be clear, I'm not accusing them of duplicitousness on this. It would appear as though this was above board. They worked with the creator of the ROM hack to incorporate it into this release, and that's nice. But once again, it falls back on that, what does this release offer that's better than emulating? And the answer is, no, nothing really. You can just get Clock Tower Deluxe and play it through a standard emulator if you want, if that's your bag. Probably the biggest issue with Rewind mode is that at the moment, a lot of the QTEs appear to be broken in Rewind mode, and Rewind mode specifically. This game contains very proto-QTEs where essentially you just have to mash a button to prevent yourself from getting killed. However, in Rewind mode, the ending QTEs don't work the first time you do them for some reason. You're generally forced to die at least once, hit continue, and then try again and it will work the second time. No idea why, but that's how it is at the moment, and it is in fact kind of annoying because it means you have to watch the ending twice. I imagine this will be fixed relatively quickly, but for now, kind of annoying. So what else does Clock Tower Rewind add? Well, it's stuff I think indicates that the team behind the project definitely had a certain amount of passion for Clock Tower. I get the distinct impression that Clock Tower Rewind is very much a passion project that nevertheless wasn't given a whole lot of budget to work with. The primary extra is the motion comic, where they have taken, translated, and dubbed the comics that were included with the instruction manual of the PlayStation release and the strategy guide that came with the PlayStation release. These are pretty cool. They're not life-changing or anything, but they're pretty cool. They're super fan stuff, you know? They try to do something neat with the resources available to them, and for what it's worth, I appreciate that. There's also an interview with the game's primary creative Hifumi Kono, scans of the instruction manual and strategy guide and what have you, although they are not translated to English, so if you can't read Japanese, you're shit out of luck on these. And kinda confusingly, one of the pages has been scanned upside down, so that's fun. A particularly super fan inclusion is the presence of the commercial sampler demo. This is a demo that I think would have been brought to trade shows or something. I'm not completely sure what this would have been used for, but this was unearthed by a member of the Clock Tower fan community, like 4 months before this release was even due to come out. That they were willing to incorporate it into the final release on such short notice does indicate that they do care about this kind of thing. The commercial sampler itself is a brief affair, really only of interest again to Clock Tower superfans, but it's nice that it's there, and I think that really sums up the nature of Clock Tower Rewind. Nice that it's there, but primarily only of interest to superfans. I think the greatest value of this release is actually the translations that were done, not to English, but to every other language. To my knowledge, there were no other translations of the original Clock Tower to French, German, Italian, Spanish, Korean, and the 2 flavors of Chinese. So if you're a player who doesn't speak English or Japanese, this may very well be the only option available to you to play Clock Tower, and I think the value of that shouldn't be understated. I know it likely doesn't apply to you if you're listening to this video, but it's a thing that I think goes underappreciated by a lot of coverage. Clock Tower Rewind is a convenient release that does nevertheless highlight the struggle of making these releases sound like a good value proposition. I think the team did a pretty good job with the very clearly not a lot of budget they had. There's in fact hints in the game that they were trying to pitch some kind of HD remake or something, because if you look in the credits of the production, you can see what are quite clearly HD test animations for Jennifer's various walking and run cycles, so it seems like maybe they wanted to go bigger, but were unable to for whatever reason. And if I may impolitely speculate, this game was supposed to come out in 2023 and instead has released in the back half of 2024. It's a re-release of a SNES game, so I get the impression that it was not a priority project for the company. A re-release of a Super Nintendo game probably shouldn't take an extra year's worth of development time. Nevertheless, I think the end result reflects real, genuine passion for the subject matter. But whether or not it's worth it? For new players, I think the value is the convenience, and for returning players, I think the value is vocalizing your support for the franchise. But for everyone else in between, I think they may struggle to see the value somewhat. But if you're interested, this is a perfectly solid way of playing this classic game. Hey, thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and consider subscribing to the channel. More things like this coming soon, and let me know what your thoughts are in the comments. And if you want your name in these credits, consider checking out the Patreon, where patrons get early access to all my videos and their name in the credits. Thanks again for watching, ta-ta for now.